you guys, like, there's a lot of people screaming, covenants are the ticking time bomb that's going to destroy, right?
Yes.
So we'll sort of address, like, the covenant's a big topic, it's huge. But let's address, like, the concerns the community has one at a time, and I'll come back at you with, like, what I'm hearing, what I'm translating what you're saying into what I'm hearing, and then trying to assuage your fears with the the design behind covenants, or the way I would design them anyway, which can end up being very different from the way they end up designing them. So why don't you guys give me one of the issues that people are worried about with covenants?
I think the biggest issue, number one, is that they won't be balanced properly, and there'll be one covenant that's better than the other three covenants, and that will create a situation where players don't actually have a choice because they feel like they have to pick the covenant that's numerically strongest.
Right, for their particular class,
yes,
or spec, or whatever it is, right? Okay, so that there's a power choice that overrides all the other choices, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that even just that one right there is extremely complex to break down. But here's a couple things I'll say. One is, let's talk about performance. Like, when it goes to, here's a piece of content and your raid has to beat it, and it's up to you to perform, and everyone has this job, right? And they're trying to perform at their best. So what defines, like, performance totals? And there's a million things that contribute to overall performance. The strategic element, which is what choices have you made before you even show up, right? Have you made good
consumables?
Yeah, consumables. Yeah. Have you gotten all your world buffs? Have you made good talent choices? Have you made good itemization choices? Do you know what buttons you're going to push and in what order to make your rotations really tight and perform really well, right? Like, so there's tons of decisions there, and in all of these things, there's good and there's bad choices, right? So good players will make high-end decisions, and bad players will make low-end decisions, and everything in between. So there's a lot of variance within that, right? In the actual performance. So that's one element, right? Then there's the tactical element of, well, once I get in there and I want to perform, but things are going weird, like they're not exactly going as planned, and so how do I respond to that? Like, we lost a tank early, or one of the healers died, or the tank's doing a bad job, which means I have to compensate, or this certain mechanic came out at a weird time, and now I have to adjust my rotations, to get back on track, right? That's all the tactical stuff, and within there's a bunch of choices, good and bad, that modify the overall performance. There's variance in there. And then there's just actual performance. Am I actually pushing the buttons that I'm supposed to be? I knew the strategy, I know the tactics, but am I actually am I a good enough gamer, right, to elevate my skill to the point where I'm performing? So there's all these elements, right? And you can make good, like, there's just so much variance across so many different elements that modify ultimately what's going to be your sort of total performance. And then there's like mood. Like, you got the one guy whose mom is yelling at him from downstairs because he hasn't gotten his hot pockets, right? And she's been yelling at him. He's all distracted, right?
Yeah.
So he's blowing his rotations. Then there's the other guy who, like, just broke up with his girlfriend, and, like, now he's free to play WoW all day, so he's super happy and he can just perform out of his skin, right? Like, he's
not happy.
So he's going crazy. He's good. Anyway, so you have all of these elements, right? Now you're going to put covenants into this blender, right? And covenants, let's say they're 5 or 10%, like, in total, and, like, its power level, right? And you're going to tell me that this is the only thing that matters, right, in terms of performance. This is the thing that's going to get you over this raid, right? It's going to get you past this raid. And so that's what I have a hard time believing, right? It's like the power level of a covenant is, like, lost within this huge pool of gigantic variance.
Oh yeah.
I want to move down that line for a second, because I actually think that there was a fulcrum shift during the game, and I'm curious how you feel about it, because I agree wholeheartedly that one of the things that made World of Warcraft such an interesting thing with such high replayability is the fact that you had this beautiful ballet routine that you wanted to do, but the game kept throwing wrenches at you. But at a certain point, when add-ons get added and player skill increases, the way that those fights were designed started to shift a whole bunch. And all of a sudden, a lot of the things based on your loadout became the ways that you were going to be able to get the fight down, right? Like the actual checks of the game changed a lot. And I think a lot of people see that now when they play different things like Classic, for example. Is it as mechanically challenging in the same elements that retail is? Absolutely not. It's a very different game, and that allows for different affordances. So what's your take on how the raids and endgame content are actually balanced now compared to how they used to be balanced?
Yeah, so I don't know specifically because I haven't raided, right? So, and I don't know how covenants are going to be balanced either. I should also say, like, I throw out that number 10% or 5%, but in reality, I have no idea where they're going to set that balance point. But, and then, you know, to speak to your point, Rich, like the mechanics are one of those things that you learn over time. So you can advance, you can, like, how much you know about the game and your ability to perform with those criteria increases the more you do it, right? The more reps you put in, the more you're going to understand the mechanics. You're going to get better. Whereas in covenants, it's static. You know, you're not going to be able to change that value, right? You're not going to be able to take your covenant power level of 10% and make it 20% over time because that's just it's a static value, right? So, and so a lot of people, that's why they eliminate, you know, that other stuff from the conversation, or try to, and say, well, covenants is just this 10% I can't do anything about. I can't get better, you know, at it. But again, it's like, where are they going to put the balance point? And that's what I'm not sure about. But I think what people are assuming is that they're going to F it up, right? They're going to put the balance point at a ridiculous point.
We are assuming that. Or I am.
And that's totally fair. I totally understand, because, you know, again, they've squandered a lot of that trust, right? And you guys don't have as much faith in them these days as maybe you did back when
I wanted to ask you, like, kind of as a parallel, whenever you said that game developers are partly psychologists, and were you familiar with the way that the Titan forging system worked in Legion?
Not in Legion, but I did play retail last year 1 to 120 in BFA.
Okay.
And I did experience both forging and Titan forging.
So basically, I think that whenever you talk about the way that the covenants affect players, I think there's a large psychological element to it as well. And I think that psychological element was echoed also in Titan forging. Whenever you see somebody else get a much larger bonus to their damage and they gain some advantage in the game, that's basically through chance or through just the fact that they happen to pick the right one, and then you don't have that advantage, I think there's a negative psychological aspect that creates.
Yeah, for sure.
And whenever you look at the actual numbers, like, you know, is the difference between like one good Titan Forge and not having one going to really make you a better player? Absolutely not. But it's a psychological impact that it has, and the demotivational aspect of that is, I feel like that's kind of echoed in Covenants as well. I don't know how many people agree with me with that, but that's at least like my read on it.
Right. So yeah, you're worried that you're going to make a choice that more often than not is going to mean you're less powerful than you could potentially be, right? Because let's say like the content is evenly distributed perfectly across, you know, like all the bosses want different covenant combinations, and you can only be one. Therefore, 25% of the time you're syncing up, and 75% of the time you're not syncing up. And so you see it as, in total, 75% of the time you're worse than you could be, right? As opposed to being, you know, if I could change it whenever I wanted, I'd be 100% powerful at all times. But I would give up. Here's the thing you give up, is the ability to look like the thing I want to look like, right? And so, yeah, it's so funny, because here's another thing that people throw at is I want to wear the pink hat, right? Let's say one of the covenants, you get a pink hat, you get a yellow shirt on another covenant, you get the Jaina mount on the third, you know, the third covenant. Oh, for sure, it's a great one. And then the fourth one is the sweet edgelord anime haircut, right? which of course everybody wants. And that's like the super powerful one, by the way. So
of course
you can identify the people that are, power gamers by their edgelord haircuts.
Yeah.
The real power gamers don't have hair.
Yeah, that's about right.
That's true, actually. Yeah, so people are worried that, I really want to wear the pink hat through all of my adventures and be the most powerful, right?
Yes.
But that's a very different thing than I want to be the most powerful all the time, and I don't care what hat or shirt or I have to, wear to do it. So, like, what would you say is the truth there? Like, obviously everyone wants their cake and eat it too, but do you want covenants to be a meaningful choice in either cosmetic or in power level?
I think cosmetic, most people agree that they want to have it be a cosmetic choice.
Right.
I think the power level is really where a lot of the contention happens.
I think personally, my biggest game an interesting series of decisions. I think everybody will stand by that. But the second that one choice that a player makes affects every single avenue, and it's all tangled up with no real logic to why it's affecting your cosmetic, your power level, and all those things.
Right.
Yes, when you lock in your character, you've just made the biggest decision that you're going to make in the game. You are all of the sudden a rogue, and because you're a rogue, that opens up how you're going to play the game. That's great. If covenants are going to add a dynamic power level, I think that's great. But why is that going to affect what your daily quests are to some degree, right? Like where you're primarily spending your time, which zone you're in. Why is it going to affect your cosmetics as well? Like, do you think that having all of that tangled together is actually a good thing?
Yeah. So I do, because I'm an old school, game developer, right? Like when you think about classic, a ton of things were tied up in identity, right? We talked about this on the after show last time, the value of identity. And one of the first big choices you make is your class, right? What class are you? Actually, kind of even before that, what faction are you? Like, look at how powerful the faction is in terms of your identity. And how meaningful that is, but it does come with a power consequence, right? There are power consequences within that choice, because it's going to determine what classes you have available. It determined what racials you had available. In the priest case, the racial class race abilities. There were all kinds of meaningful power impact on that choice, and it was one you couldn't change easily, right? Your class was another one, right? So there are things on that scale of changeable power dynamics that massively impact your sense of identity that matter to people, right? So can covenants add to that, or is it just too late for retail? Like, is retail so far down the rabbit hole of nothing can be meaningful in those ways again? Because there's a lot of people that want to merge the factions, right?
Oh, yeah.
Is that a good thing for the game? Like, is that the right direction? Or do we want to strip the last bit of identity out of the game so that we don't identify with Horde and Alliance anymore? Do we want to strip class from the game?
Yeah.
Like, I can switch classes anytime I want.
Do you think at a certain point, when you've gotten to a place where I think we all know that player numbers have declined quite a bit since we were playing earlier versions of the game, do you ever get to a certain point that because the player numbers are so low that you have to make decisions that try to salvage the player bases there and enable them to play with people, or is that a death sentence for the game?
Yeah, that's probably one of the toughest questions to answer. Yeah. Great one. Because people ask me, what would I do with retail right now? It's not the first time I've been told, put me back in charge of retail, have me fix the game. But what does that even mean? What do I do with the current retail group that just wants to keep playing their game and having fun, and they feel like it's their game, and everyone who's bailed on it, it's not their game anymore, so screw them. Let them play classic and shut the hell up, kind of thing. And so what would I even do, right, with retail? Should I even do anything, or should I just kind of gently euthanize it, right? Because that's the direction it's going, right? That's the way it's always been going. So And it's possible it might just hover at 1 million people or whatever for the rest of the time, but do we want to get some of those people back? Do we want to broaden the experience? Do we want to, again, I'll bring it back to the kid, playing the game with his dad, right? Like, do I want covenants to matter so that you have to figure out a way to beat the content despite the fact that you can't switch covenants whenever you want? You got to wear that pink hat, son. You want to wear that pink hat, you got to go in with that pink hat in every raid and figure out how to beat that content, right? Some of the raids are going to be good for you, like that's going to line up with the right power choices, and you're going to be good, and it's going to give you special bonuses, and you're going to feel like your moment to shine is here. And then the rest of the time you're going to have to manage, right? Like, what's ultimately better for the group of people playing retail right now? Or should I just kind of let it auto switch? Every time you go into a new raid, here's your new power, or better yet, there's just a button next to the covenants, and there's a little star next to the one you should be before you go into the raid. It's like, push this button, change to this one. Yeah. You should be this, we've mathematically determined, this is the right one for you. Push that button, the little star next to it. It sparkles up when you push it, makes you feel real good, trips all those endorphins. And off you go, right?
Well, what do you think about, so obviously I think one of the biggest changes between vanilla WoW and classic WoW is the amount of information that's available. And I think that I'm not really sure how familiar you are with the high-end raiding scene in retail, but Alliance is basically dead. For example, the Hall of Fame for one of the raids that came out in this expansion was filled up by Horde relatively quickly, and Alliance never filled it up. It never got filled. And so what's actually happened with the factions in retail WoW is that people have they've actually trended so much towards Horde for PvE that recruiting on Alliance is extremely hard to do. And I think that's what's really driven a lot of the people who want to see the factions merged. And I played WoW since Warcraft 2, so I don't really want to see that, from a lore perspective. But it's hard not to be able to make a pragmatic argument that it's a good idea. And
that's sort of a consequence of how easy it is to switch, right? I
agree.
If it were a pain in the ass to switch, people wouldn't be as willy-nilly about it, right?
Well, the same thing happened in Classic, though, I would say. If you look at the way that, a lot of these PvP servers have went, it's trended much more towards an imbalance on one side or another. There are many sides that went 90% Horde or 90 or 80% Alliance. And I don't know exactly, how do you reconcile players that nowadays are so goal-oriented with the way that they want to achieve those goals, and they're very meticulous. And you have people people whose jobs literally are to teach you how to play the game. How do you reconcile that with still having those meaningful choices like covenants or like factions?
Right. Well, first of all, I want to address the core problem there and basically the fake news you're trying to push on us. The reason that Horde are winning on those servers is because the Horde generally attracts strong, capable people, because the Horde is far better than the Alliance. So you can't say that it's just because they're people are goal oriented now or whatever.
We saw what all you devs did for the Horde. We already knew that you guys felt this way.
Come on. Okay, so anyway. It is tough. It's a tough experiment to prove, right? Because that's the other question: is, are gamers different now than they were back then? In some fundamental way. And it's a tough experiment. The thought experiment, for me, is okay, we released 2 brand new MMOs, and they're both amazing in all aspects, except one is kind of retail philosophy and one is classic or vanilla philosophy, right? And which one is more successful at the end of the day? Which one has just more people playing it? And it's a tough thing to say. Everyone's going to go towards retail because the gamer base has changed. And it's also, by the way, it's all new play. It has to be all new players. It can't be people that are nostalgic or anything like all of us are out of this experiment. It has to be all brand new players. that have never played an MMO, to kind of see which one is more popular. So, but yeah, the way I reconcile it is we don't know until we try these things. And I mentioned this on the after show last time, is that I think covenants are this grand experiment to test the waters to see, like, how much do people still care about identity? How much do they care about choices that are going to change their experience and can't easily be changed? Is there any room for it left, right, in game design? I think it's of critical importance nowadays, to make, to like create identity and make meaningful choices in games, and always responding to this call for, I need maximum flexibility, and I can't be paced in any way so that, time becomes meaning or challenge becomes meaning or anything like that, like, be thrown out. I think it's just the wrong direction, right? Like, look how popular Dark Souls was. Dark Souls came at a time when every game was just press A to win. And Dark Souls came out and blew us all away because it was like, no, you got to earn this shit, right? You got to go in there and you got to earn it. And Dark Souls isn't even that hard, right? Like,
no,
yeah, as we beat
gamers, right? Like, we've all beaten it. Competent gamers beat Dark Souls. And it's not like it was the hardest thing in the world, but it was just so much harder than press A to win that it just, like, it blew us away, right? Like,
yeah. I don't know about that. I mean, if you use Vort's hammer, it's pretty much press A to win. It's great, let me tell you.
Right.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the min-maxers getting a hold of Dark Souls, right? Like,
oh yeah,
it's press A to win, yeah, right. But again, Dark Souls is like, it's it's a badge of honor, right? Like, even though it's not that hard, and min-maxers are going like, what is everyone talking about? It's still sort of a badge of honor that you can flex on your friends, like, oh, I beat Dark Souls, right? And it's like, that feels good, right? So we need more of that, right? Not less. And some of that comes from putting in meaningful choices and people dealing with the consequences, right? Sometimes you are not going to be at your most powerful, and you have to figure out a way to succeed anyway, right? And I think that does a lot of good for the game. And I don't think the direction of, like, well, now this game plays like League of Legends, where I just pick my champion before the raid, and I can gear them however I want on the fly, and all the choices are made within the game, and I just run it, and then I can do something else. Is the right direction. I don't think the Diablo direction is the right direction. I don't think the League of Legends direction is the right direction.
Yeah.
This is World of Warcraft, right? Keep that shit out of our game,
I think nice. Asmund and I have had this conversation quite a few times where I kind of go back to the idea where I feel like anytime the player feels like they're getting away with something in World of Warcraft is when you have some of the biggest wins, right?
Oh, yeah.
When a dot class gets to multi-dot, for example, and like those strong moments of identity where it's like, yo, this is broken. Look at me. This is my fight. And the more homogenized you get, I don't feel like players get that identity.
And that only comes about, like, you having a moment to shine means you have to have several moments where you don't get to shine. That's the only way that happens, right?
Yeah.
And people want to eliminate both sides of that scale, and I don't know that that's the right direction. I think the right direction is, being deprived a fair bit, and then every once in a while you get to go absolutely nuts, right?
I think that we're kind of in the situation now with, like, what Ian said, is that, I mean, they're going to bring out covenants no matter what, right? No matter what the player base thinks, no matter what they want, they're going to bring this shit out.
Yeah. And they're going to force it down.
Yeah, they're going to force it on you. And if it's going to be like Legion legendaries, where, like, basically what happened is, you had, like, these random chance legendaries. Some people got really good ones, some people got bad ones. And if you got the bad ones, you were just, like, at a huge disadvantage in, like, high-end rating. And one way or another, we're going to play it, and we're going to see what's going to happen. And if I do want to say that I respect Blizzard's decision to go forward with this and their confidence in it. It's just that what I really kind of worry about is that if you compare a game like Dark Souls, for example, to a game like WoW, the biggest difference is the fact that WoW is it's a multiplayer game. And you have, like, the metas, even in classic WoW. It's harder to find groups if you're a certain class. It's harder to find groups if you're a moonkin versus a warrior. So I think people are just really worried about being moonkins in Shadowlands.
Yeah. So let's address that one. That's the other one I hear a lot is I'm going to get turned down, right? I'm going to get picked last for the kickball team, right?
Yes.
Which, you know, as nerds, we all identify with and we all hate, right? So the question I ask is like, so let's talk about the LFR. Does LFR matter in this discussion? Like, does pugging matter in this discussion?
I would say, well, pugging, I think, is pugging and high-end rating are pretty much the two main things that you want to talk about, because LFR puts you in a group with other people, and there's like pretty substantial barriers to entry to removing people from that group. So
I thought we were talking about LFR this whole time. What is there in the game besides LFR?
It's hard to know at this point. Yeah, but that's pretty much where I'm at. Yeah. Somewhere around there.
So let's talk about pugs and let's talk about, you know, high-end guilds. Like high-end guilds trying to knock down the raids. And you guys will have to fill me in because I don't know how the social structures work anymore. Because back in the day, back in my day, guilds were formed for social reasons a lot of times. The high-end guilds were about performance and social, you know, performance and social. But you didn't have unlimited choice within your guild. You know, like these are your buds. These are people that you'd done a lot of stuff with. You knew they were competent for the most part, and you'd weeded out the trash. And so what you're left with is a group of people that now have to make this choice in Covenant. And some of them, you know, let's say they're evenly distributed. It's not just the one guy who's worried about getting benched. It's 75% of your, you know, guild that's in that same boat, right? It's not one person in the boat. It's a bunch of people in that boat. And they're all sort of not ideal for this one encounter we're talking about. And the next encounter, it might change. It might shift to be, well, more of them are, less of them are, but there's a bunch of people in that boat. So is it still a huge problem if both people or a ton of people are in the boat? Because the guildmaster still has to put a team together, right? And if he's looking at like half of his, you know, roster isn't the ideal setup, he can't bench them all because then he can't run the raid. So, have guilds changed significantly in that respect? So so they will bounce and get new people in.
Well, people get. What really usually happens is that it's not necessarily that one person. Like 75% are doing the like non-optimal thing. I think that what it is from like my perspective, usually whenever I see different guilds make these decisions, is that you have like, let's say 2 warriors or 2 mages, and one warrior is using the correct setup and the other warrior is not. Guess who makes it into the raid? And I think that's really what it ends up happening. Now, whenever it comes to each individual player, then obviously the guildmaster has to make certain decisions and not take every single optimal player. But I think that in many cases, if you go and you look at the logs and parses, and even for some of the like not really as well progressed guilds, but still, you know, guilds that are trying to do something, many of them are using the exact same things. And for PvP, it's even more the case. If you look at like the top PvP talents, very many of them are pretty much the same for different situations and different comps.
I think it actually, there's like a weird stop before you even get to that though now, because there is no scarcity of gear. So a lot of the times you don't even have people making a lot of the decisions, I feel like, in guilds for the average player. And I'm sure a lot of people in chat will maybe disagree with this, but I feel like a lot of the times the average player is just simply looking for people to play with, because people get the gear that they need off the first 3 bosses by pugging it, and then they just don't raid anymore.
Okay. So they pug and then or they luck into Titan forging and or unluck out of Titan forging.
If I showed you the loot table right now of the current raid, like for example, I'll use Hunters as an example. There's a bow off of Skitra, which is one of the early bosses that is just like an ideal bow. It has like a very strong corruption on it that makes Hunters feel very powerful, more playable. It's actually a great piece of loot with how it feels, but it's very early. There are 2 pieces of Azerite gear at the very end, which are your best in slot and the ideal Azerite to go for most situations. But you can also get comparable Azerite if you spam Mythic Dungeons, for example. It's not as
Right.
good, but the amount of effort that you need to put in to get those last 2 bosses down, people just screw it, man. I'll just pug the first 3
not worth the
bosses
time
that are
investment.
super easy. I'll get the Skipper Bell, and then I'm done.
Right. But is that at the low end, or is that at the like highest raid level tier? Are people still pugging like the highest raid tiers?
Ooh, a little bit. I mean, like you'll see people that pug the first 3 bosses in Mythic Nyalotha. I mean, this is obviously like you're talking about like a number of concentric circles of players, right? People that are max level, people that care about rating, people that care about rating a lot, people that care about maximizing their characters. So like how many people really are doing this, it's hard to say. But I think that what happens, and this is probably something that's more relatable, is whenever you queue up for a dungeon and you want to be invited to this group and somebody gets taken over you because they're just a different class or a different spec.
Right.
I think
and that's a very common experience, right? In current WoW.
Oh, yeah.
And so we're worried about extending that, into
covenants.
with the covenant system, right? Yeah. So this is definitely a problem that goes away if you don't have unlimited choice, right? Like the people you have to choose from to get the job done is, a select group. And the group is selected because only the cream has risen to the top, right? Like you have to be a really good player, and perform at a very high level to be at the, on the team at the high end. And so the more the game is dumbed down, like the more just average Joes find their way into the pool of, selectables. So part of that is the problem. The other thing is, so let's play it out. Let's play out this experiment that we're worried about. So I'm in a guild, or I'm trying to pug. Well, let's talk about the guild case, because this is what I think probably people should care about the most, right? Like pugging is a mess. Like that's not a fun experience anyway. No. I hate to tell you, but so let's talk about the guild experience. You mentioned before there's 2 warriors, and one warrior's getting picked because he's the right covenant, and the other guy isn't.
Yeah.
So the one guy gets benched. He's out. They go and they do the raid. They get gear. Now he's on farm status for a little bit. Like again, these are all old terms too, because I feel like in the modern game, you don't just kill one boss and then farm him for a while until you're ready for the next boss. You clear the whole wing or whatever, like all in one night.
You go as far as you can.
But the next fight is going to have different demands. The next fight is going to have that the warrior got benched in the first fight. Now he's the right covenant combination, right? And the guy who got pulled in isn't. So now what happens as we play this out, right? Like is the first guy still getting picked because his gear is better because he was able to farm the first guy? Or is like the only thing that matters the covenant choice? And again, we can't know because we don't know how they're going to balance things.
Well, the way that it usually goes for me, right, is that you pick the option that's best most often. So for example, like you have 9 bosses, and if one covenant is better on 6 of those bosses, that's the covenant that you go with. So usually
you try to knock all 6 down, or all 9 down in one night.
Well, it's more that like if you,
or do you swap out on a fight to fight basis?
Yeah, like generally the way that I think people will make decisions for these covenants that are raiders are you're going to look at the bosses that are going to be the biggest roadblocks. So like probably your first DPS check boss, your last 2 bosses, last boss, and people are going to choose their covenants based off of that. So you're not really looking at optimizing covenants for the individual fights that are before that. It's more so optimizing covenants whenever you run into those roadblocks that are actually challenging. Because what you're saying, you're right, is like 90%. Yeah, 90% of the time, like your damage doesn't really matter that much in the fights. And in retail WoW, just do the mechanics, and most bosses will die unless you're in like a top 50 guild.
And then, so, but the perception is that the covenant will matter way more than a lot of this other stuff. Again, like on that performance, blob I was talking about before, covenants are going to be the most important element of that. It's not the guy who's a known consistent performer that is always topping the charts, but he happens to be the wrong covenant for this roadblock fight. Like he's going to get benched because we need a guy with the right covenant. Is that the worry? Like,
I think that there will be cases for that. So, like for example, there was one boss in Uldir where combat rogues were just like really, or outlaw rogues, I guess, were just like really, really overpowered for this boss.
okay.
So it didn't really matter how good you were at playing at your other class if you just had a combat rogue that could just come in and dumpster everybody else on damage. It like didn't even really make a difference at all. Oh, it was subtlety. Okay, well, regardless, it was one rogue spec that was just ridiculously broken, and I think that's kind of what people are concerned about is because you're not just looking. The covenants have like there's like a force multiplier with covenants, that it's not just this ability, it's also the soul binds that modify your spells and give your spells like additional effects. So it's like you're going to have one, the odds are, right? And this is like things that Blizzard have done in the past, right? With like Legion of Legendaries, generally players will find out that there is one that's better than the other ones in a situation that's the highest ratio, and they will just go with that one. So it will just be kind of expected that people go with the one that works 70% of the time than the one that works 40% of the time.